Please welcome the Honorable Jeff Merrifield, Brad Rearden, Dr. Youssef Ballout, John Borland, and Igor Dubinsky.
With the stars and stripes and the eagle fly. It's a big old land with countless dreams, and happiness ain't out of reach. Hard work pays off.
Well, folks, thank you very much. We're back from lunch and getting ready as the warm-up act for Governor Abbott, who we're really looking forward to hear from. I want to sort of quote, a used movie line, and now for something completely different. So we're going to be talking about national security and how nuclear technologies can be used to defend our nation and other interesting uses in space and otherwise. And so we got a great panel here. We have Igor Dubinsky, who's a PhD Director of Defense Programs at BWXT. John Borland, who is the Director of Widelity, LLC. Dr. Brad Rearden, the head of reactor deployments for Antares Nuclear, and Dr. Youssef, who is the CEO of KADMOS Energy, and he's formerly a division director at INL. So a really well-qualified panel, and we're going to cover a bunch of different things. First, I want to sort of kick it off and have you all comment on this. You know, historically, the U.S. has really been a global leader on safety, safety, safeguards, and nonproliferation. If we're going to continue to be able to lead that role, obviously we've got challenges both with China and Russia, things that they're trying to do internationally. If you could paint for our audience a little bit, what are the results that we could see in a negative consequence from allowing them to take more of a leadership position internationally? And what are the kind of things that we ought to be doing right now to change that kind of trajectory? And I guess on this one, I'll start on the end with Youssef and work this
Okay, thank you. So nuclear technology, everybody would agree, is American-born, American-raised, and American-delivered to many places on the planet. Started obviously with Admiral Rickover and the way he did things. Today, we actually stand at the precipice in terms of if China and Russia, actually, they're the two leaders in this business outside the United States, become dominant in places like Africa, the Middle East, and other places in the world that deliver in these reactors. If we actually don't continue to do what we're doing in the past, the standards that we actually created for the world could degrade. The safety posture that we actually have created and most people adopted could change. And then also, like cybersecurity issues, they become more difficult for us actually to make sure that anything that goes into a reactor in terms of cyber issue is safe. And so the cost to this country in terms of losing that technological dominance and delivery of reactors across the globe is very big for us. And also keep in mind, there is one thing that's very important on the commercial level. It's basically a century commitment. If the United States actually loses the ability to deliver a reactor to Kenya, I'm picking a country who's very interested in nuclear technology, and the Chinese get it, it'll be probably a century for us to get back in, and you can duplicate that answer across the globe.
Right.
Yeah, so certainly having energy to enable our warfighters is key, and also having the resiliency to maintain our critical infrastructure domestically is also key to the success of the United States. And further, keeping our adversaries at bay, we need redundancy, we need resiliency, we need the ability to project power to remote and austere locations in a way that's meaningful and doesn't have long supply chains and logistics associated with it. And furthermore, getting out into space and carrying power and projecting power from space, it will be very important carrying the country forward and ensuring that we can be aware of what our adversaries are doing and have countermeasures to prevent war.
Well, he stole a little bit of my thunder with respect to the idea of...
we're on the same page.
Yeah, contested logistics there, but the general idea of once you introduce a technology such as an SMR into the battlefield, and this is something I've been working on towards the end of my military career, is adopting how we would actually change how we project that force forward and what that might look like and the capabilities we can put into those warfighters' hands closer to the point of need. Get that production point for both energy and all the other highly valuable assets that we can do for advanced manufacturing and whatnot closer to where the need is. I'll also touch on the idea that as a nation, we need to be looking forward and see where the adversaries are taking advantage of certain opportunities to capture what is needed to stand back up this industry. We got to make sure that we're being competitive in that space too, because if we don't get out in front and ensure that we have the ability to actually scale up our production, we'll be just as behind, and I think it will take an awful long time to catch up.
Yeah, I think BWXT is an interesting company because we've been making nuclear reactors for the United States Navy for the last 70 years. And so if you look at what in the national security nuclear has been doing, it's deterrence, right? It's deterrence to our adversaries, our competitors from in the national security space from getting ahead of us. And so us being at the forefront of that, we must lead. We must lead with actions, not just talk. So I think the actions of the last couple of years, what the Department of War has been doing in its leadership in pushing nuclear forward, the Department of Energy, it really sets the stage. It really sets the stage for the United States to be that global leader. And our allies and partners are always looking at us. They're looking at what we're doing, and can they emulate what we're doing, and can they interrelate with what we're doing? And so if we stop, to your question of if we lose that leadership role, if we step back from the world and we don't develop nuclear and somebody else will do it. And we know that, we're painfully aware of that. And if we step back from that, then when we go to our next global conflict, which, we're always bad at predicting them, but they always happen, we will not have the level of support that we would had we been a leader. And that goes across the board, but especially in the nuclear space, where nuclear in the military sense means deterrence. Nuclear in the civilian sense also means deterrence because it's economic and it's all the other instruments of power.
Well, I think the other thing I'd add to this mix, it's not a one-way street either, because I recollect several years ago I was in Kenya for a nuclear conference, and there were over a dozen African countries that were indicating that they wanted to embrace nuclear energy in one way or the other, and they the message that we kept getting, and I was part of a U.S. delegation, was we want American technology. We know how the Russians and Chinese behave and engage with countries. We don't want that. We know that the Americans are a trusted partner, and that's something we simply can't forget either. We got the technology, but also those relationships are really important. Well, let me go back. Igor, you talked a little bit about the work that BWXT has been doing. You were one of the two companies, X Energy being the other that was selected to produce a microreactor for deployed applications. Some folks may not be as familiar with the Pele program. Maybe you can give an update on where that stands and what that really could mean as that program goes forward regarding how we're going to be operating in forward areas and how that may transform our warfighting capabilities.
Absolutely. Great question. BWXT is extremely proud of the Project Pele, the Pele program, because it is the Pathfinder program for the United States military, and really, we think the United States nuclear industry as a whole. It's like I said, we talk about concrete actions. This is a concrete action by the Department of Defense, now Department of War, to say that we are going to lead nuclear, we're going to build nuclear, we're going to get it into the warfight for our forces. And so Project Pele, just to give you a quick history, 2016, the Defense Science Board looked at the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they said over 50% of casualties that we took in Iraq and Afghanistan were due to fuel convoys and water convoys. So these long, mile-long, 2-mile-long convoys, 5,000 a year in Iraq, more than that in Afghanistan. All of those, you had if you were one of those convoys, you had a high chance, 4% chance that you might get hit and somebody might take a casualty. So from a personnel, human being, United States soldiers, civilians that are in the warfight, that is not acceptable. The other piece is the entire logistics chain that has to come back from that fuel pump in the United States or that port of entry where a commercial company delivers that gallon of fuel, and everything that has to go from that gallon of fuel into the theater of war, deployed from a port of now disembarkation, and all the way to the warfighter somewhere on a base like Bagram Air Force Base or another big base, not only costs us a lot, but has incredible logistics challenges. And this was during the global war on terror. We predict, that when we are in a near peer or peer fight with an adversary that doesn't allow us to control the seas and the air and everything in between, that challenge will get exponentially harder. And so I think it's pretty visionary of the Defense Science Board to say, we need a microreactor to replace this entire logistics chain spanning 5,000, 7,000, 10,000 miles, and just collapse that all into one small box that can be delivered to a point of, on a military base, and then that base can run on its own. And so that's how Project Pele was born. Project Pele requirements were a reactor in a Connex box. That's a sea lane container, 20 foot, the smaller of the standard shipping containers, and the reactor had to fit in there. Big engineering problem, really tough engineering challenge, which we solved, but that allows now the warfighter to be independent of that entire logistic tail. And so it's an exciting project. We got that contract in 2022. We're extremely proud. Our heritage as a company is in the national security space, and this aligned so well with our what we aim to do, which is national security for the nation. And since 2022, we've been building this project in Lynchburg, Virginia. July of this year, this is a great time for the contract because just in July, we started core cartridge assembly. So it's being built. You can come in and touch it. Probably you don't want to touch it, but you can be right next to it. And you can see it being built. And so that's exciting for our workforce because we're really building it. It's concrete. And it's going to be a real reactor. So once it's built, and it's going to deploy probably on a C-17 to simulate the whole deployment chain to Idaho National Lab, 26, 27. And then it's going to be set up, and it's going to turn on, and it's going to produce power and electricity, and it's going to power real things. And so it'll be up to the Department of War what they want to power with it, and the Department of Energy. But very easily, they could pull up real military weapons and military radars and whatever else they want to pull up to it and plug it in and actually demonstrate that this thing works the way it's intended to work. Now, the requirements on it were a 20-foot Connex box, so very small, 3 years of operational life, between 1 and 5 megawatts electric, and it had to be deployable on a C-17 airplane, which is a very hard thing to do. And then once it's delivered, 3-day black start condition and a 7-day cool down condition. Those were the requirements given by the Strategic Capabilities Office. We've got those.
Yeah, so let me ask two follow-ups. One, so what's the target right now for producing power, number one? And number two, the logistics story is an excellent one, but obviously warfighting has changed. Events in Ukraine have changed some relative to drones, hypersonic weapons, the ability to use directed energy systems, lasers, could be really enabled by this kind of technology. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely, great question, because one of the things that we've looked at and discussed is that cutting the logistics chain is great because that enables all the things that we talked about. But what it also does is it enables all kinds of new things and new capabilities at the point end of the spear. And so the Project Pele will go to INL and start producing power at the end of 2027 and 2028. It'll meet the national security executive order timeline that President Trump set out for a operational reactor to be powering operational equipment on Army base. By September 30th, 2028, we will be producing power well before that. And it's up to the Army, obviously, and the Department of Defense and Department of War what gets pulled up to it, but it'll meet that timeline. Now, I think a great question is, what else does it do, right? And I heard a great analogy the other day is, if we want to really change the game and we want more things, we don't want to invent a candle that burns a little brighter. We want to invent electricity. And I think Project Pele and microreactors change that game. They change the game to the point where once you have abundant power at your point of need, the Department of War likes to refer to it as the point of need, because that could be Ukraine, or it could be Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, or it could be somewhere out on an island in the Pacific that's right before we jump into that.
Gosh, I hope we're not in Bagram Air Force.
I do too.
I think we've had enough of that one for a while, but point well taken.
I agree with you. I spent some time out there and saw all these things live. But now what we enable is a lot of different things where we don't need that supply chain. So, there's capabilities like desalination of water, very simple. We can make water on the ground, on an island, or I keep referring to Bagram because that's sort of, what everybody's familiar with. But, we can make that on the ground for the warfighter without really anything except abundant energy, and that energy exists there. We can make things like synthetic fuels right at the point of need where we, suck carbon out of the air and turn that right back into JP level fuel, and that powers the things that we're not going to electrify. We can apply abundant energy to a whole lot of things like directed energy weapons that can now be operated on a base that previously couldn't be because there just wasn't that power, or it's they're only operated 50, 20% of the time because of the lack of power.
Yeah. So really enabling a much wider diversity of capabilities on that forward deployment. Let's switch back to continental United States. John, obviously we talked a lot about Pele. There's also the DoD Resilient Energy Program, and more recently we've heard about the Janus program to really bring some of these technologies to military bases here in the continental United States. Can you talk a little bit about what that Janus project means and the impacts you think it's going to have for accelerating the kind of technologies we're talking about?
Absolutely. One of the things, so right as Pele was coming on, we had the whole Pele team down to work, and we wanted to show them all of our activities, because when I think about forward operations, I think forward operations actually start at the first point in which you have to go expeditionary. You have to get outside your day-to-day regular way of doing things, and that's not, had the luxury of not being here in the U.S. for a long, long time, but we need to be prepared for it to be here. So we start talking about hardening our bases and ensuring that we can truly island and cut off from external entities if something were to happen so that we can then respond. That's becoming more and more important. There's been a couple of different exercises we've done in which we've turned off the lights purposely to see whether or not we can respond to it. And it illuminated an awful lot. So when you start thinking about what Pele does, both the form factor it comes in and the way and lessons that we can learn as we implement the first one onto an actual base, whether it's a Pele 2.0 or whether it becomes Janus, I highly encourage everybody to watch that closely, because much like we did, I'm an engineer officer, it's actually back in the day, the engineer officers were the ones that were working on the Manhattan Project and trying to bring that to life. And I take a certain amount of pride of our motto is let us try, essayons. And so as we get out there and we start to bring this technology to bear, I think there's going to be an awesome lot of lessons. I think Janus is going to, again, highlight what's right for the trade-offs that we have to produce, and then as well as, I think there's a good opportunity for it to help us relook at some of the regulatory bodies and what is going to prevent elsewhere for people to adopt. I know there's a lot of momentum around it, and I know that we don't know all the problems we're going to encounter as we look to try to bring this to light, but I was actually in D.C. with Igor a couple days ago when they were doing the announcement, and it's great to see the momentum and then to follow it up with a trip down here and just seeing the momentum around nuclear and around the new, that whole enterprise moving forward. I think it's awesome. I think we're going to hit a couple hurdles, and we need to be prepared, and hopefully Janus will shine a light on some of those hurdles. We need to prepare to continue to push through them because we need this. It's not a maybe this will work, maybe this won't. We need to figure this out. And I do think that we need to figure it out both for home stations and for forward projection, because we got to be prepared for the fight to come here, hoping that it never does.
Great comment. Let me we talked international. We're going domestic. Now we're going really far out. So Brad, I want to go to you. Antares is working on a really the sort of the next frontier of nuclear deployment, and that is space applications. There are a lot of proposals for space propulsion, get us to a distant planet fast, and then obviously the need to have facilities on lunar locations, whether it's the moon or potentially Mars down the road, the enabling of those activities by having nuclear technologies to power the needs there. Can you talk a little bit about some of those and the things you guys are working on right now?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So, Antares was co-founded by SpaceX executives. And so we have a hardware-first mentality. You'll build it, prove it in ways that can be demonstrated, and we can learn from those very quickly and iterate on our design process. So our initial reactor design is really intended to be tested on Earth, proven on Earth, lessons learned from Project Pele, and in terms of setting the requirements that we need for deploying to forward bases, contested logistics areas, domestic bases. but always with a focus on how do you build that hardware in a way that it could also be flown in space. And so, when we already had an opportunity to do a ground test at Idaho National Lab in 2027. That was already on the books when the pilot reactor program was announced by DOE. So we've applied to the pilot reactor. We're one of the companies to be selected for that. But it's not something new for us. It's actually just another milestone on our already established trajectory. And so we're leveraging some of the supply chain things that were established for Project Pele and moving forward with a resilient, lightweight, and easy to build, fast to deploy and test solution. And NASA now has an opportunity to deploy fission surface power solutions on the lunar surface. In terms of treating national security in that space, the Chinese also have plans to deploy a nuclear reactor to the south pole of the moon. And they've made it pretty well known that once they land that reactor there, they want to establish a keep-out zone. And so they would say, well, you can't land anywhere near our nuclear reactor. So they start to sort of claim territory on the moon that can't be claimed by saying, well, it's a safety issue. You can't come down and touch our reactor. And so having a forward base on the moon is another strategic asset that could serve a great science mission and the exploration of space. Certainly the moon is the stepping stone to go explore Mars. It's much easier to assemble spacecraft from 1/6 gravity than it is to do it from Earth. And if we can have in-situ resource utilization on the moon, lunar mining, helium-3, there's a lot of resources there that come back to Earth. And then extend that out to space domain awareness, high power on orbit, really gives a lot of opportunities. You mentioned propulsion. There's been a couple of different DoD programs looking at space propulsion. Recently, both of those have been called off because it was just too difficult or too expensive. But we see the ground testing operations from Earth, Project Pele type activities to the moon, and then take the next step to go to on-orbit power. And that's really the trajectory that Antares is taking with our SpaceX mentality, but also with the nuclear safety and all the aspects that we're leveraging from the Department of Energy.
Well, it's pretty exciting stuff. I mean, and people think of that as being hard to do, but I always remind people, again, a lot of what we've done isn't entirely new. We had a very remote research station that we used nuclear power to power, and that was the Antarctic, where McMurdo Sound for a period of time had the first Army mobile reactor that was used for that application. So, I think there's some analogs there with what we're thinking about doing on the moon. Let me just a quick follow up on that. Igor talked a lot about the enabling of different activities by having a forward deployed nuclear reactor. It strikes me for a lunar application, it's the same thing: access to produce water, heat, power, advanced manufacturing that could be done in situ, and other things. Is that sort of the planning and what NASA and others are thinking at this point?
Yeah, that's absolutely the plan. And so, we would use the similar technology, but then instead of having like a heat rejection system off to air or water, you reject your heat to a space radiator. But otherwise, the technology and infrastructure, remote operations, safety systems, those are all very similar technologies, and especially in the way that Antares has structured our design. And yeah, that enables, NASA has continued to raise the power requirement for fission surface power. So, 3 years ago, they were looking at a 10 kilowatt system. 2 years ago, they're looking at a 40 kilowatt system. And this year, looking at a 100 kilowatt system. And this would be the first of the kind. And I think as they start to look at the mission needs for, having a human presence there, surviving through the lunar night, which nothing has ever survived on the moon over the 14-day nighttime that's present on the moon because it's just too cold. Electronics freeze and break. This gives us the ability to establish a permanent presence on the moon and take advantage of all the resources that are actually there in place.
Great. Now, Youssef, we're going to change a little different direction. You're following a different path with the reactor design that you're moving on. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and your philosophy? Because it's obviously quite different than some of the things we've been talking about here.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. So I spent most of my career, 26 years actually, in the nuclear Navy. And then I followed that by working with Elysium. It's the design that actually is most close to my heart. Molten salt reactor, chloride salt. So I know about advanced reactors and what it takes to actually deliver an advanced reactor. And then when I look at the terrain today, I spent the last 7 years at Idaho National Laboratory working literally on the most advanced ideas for nuclear reactors. Either talking to the industry, most of the people in the industry, one way or another, they interacted with me about their design. And I have my own ideas, and in the lab, we're building 3 different microreactors right now, and another 4th one starting in. If you're wondering, it's McCree, Pele, and Marvel, plus Valkyrie is coming in for space application. So I had my nose in all of them. I have a Lebanese nose, it's big, it gets in a lot of places. And so I was able to look at this whole thing, and I was really very happy with all of that. But then I noticed one thing. When the data center question came up, we need electrons today. And I knew that the R&D path for a lot of different things, which I just talked about, takes time. And so I look back at my career, and the people I'm working with had some chats about this, and I decided that if we're going to deliver the reactors we need to deliver to power these data centers and other things, and to stay ahead in the game when we compare what we're doing relative to our adversaries, China, Russia, and maybe others could be coming up, I decided that the best way moving forward to deliver something fast, safe, that meets all the criteria that we're required to meet is to actually look at PWR, the traditional ones, but now deliver them in an SMR form. The databases exist. The engineering talent exists. The know-how exists. Supply chain more or less exists. Absolutely the fuel exists because we power our PWRs across the country. We have, by the way, 93 reactors today, 61 PWRs and 32 BWRs. We have the system that makes them function. So I decided that we're going to come up with something that uses this technology, uses that know-how to move the country forward, not just for data centers, but actually to move it where necessary. So that's where the idea of KADMOS, that's the name of the company, KADMOS Energy. And I think this is a very sensible approach for the moment. If you asked me 10 years ago, I said, PWRs, that's just old stuff. PWRs, that's the stuff that works. That's really the difference, is answering the question of today, not what we were thinking 10 years ago or 10 years into the future. And our adversaries, they have that technology too. They know how to make SMRs. We know how to make SMRs, they're ahead of us. The Russians have been making SMRs for a long time. That's a national security question. We say, well, we can do it too. They have the KLT-40. I think right now it's 70 and 80 megawatt reactors. I have 2 of them. And China has Hulong, I think that's the name of it, and other reactors. So everybody who is competing with us, they're executing. And we're sitting back and just saying, oh, I got to wait for, and I want to name the companies, this reactor and that reactor. And I look at all of them, all great ideas. But I need it today. And so that is the concept that's standing behind KADMOS. Deliver a reactor in the future that is tomorrow. Not 10 years from today, not even 5 years from today. We do it today. And like I said, the database is all here. So that's my time is
great. Well, listen, I think there's a lot of different threads here I would love to pull, but unfortunately we ran out of time. We're going to be making a transition. We've got Governor Abbott coming. They're going to be clearing the stage off. We may have a little bit of a break, but in the meantime, please join me in thanking our guests for this great presentation.
Thank you.